Hey everyone, welcome back to another crypto miner update. So to start, let's take a look at Bitcoin because as we know, crypto miners are just a proxy for Bitcoin. And as Bitcoin will move higher, so will Bitcoin miners, and when Bitcoin moves lower, so will Bitcoin miners as well. And you can see how this Bitcoin rally that we've been seeing over the past 6 months to a year began, which was with price breaking above the monthly trigger back here. Trading view is a little bit laggy right now, could be my internet, but all right, we're back. So you can see Bitcoin, ranging against the monthly trigger here, finally gets a really big breakout. And once the daily trigger and the hourly trigger, and here the weekly trigger cross above the monthly trigger, you can see a really strong, powerful trending move. Now, topped up here at about 73, 74K, and now Bitcoin is experiencing a pullback. And so where I think we're at right now for Bitcoin is you can see here where there was a bearish hourly trigger, daily trigger crossover. That's the green trigger crossing below the blue trigger. And you can see price pulled back towards the weekly trigger before finally resolving bullishly with a bullish hourly trigger, daily trigger crossover. Price, was a little range bound above the daily trigger before exploding higher. And I think we're in a very similar situation here where unfortunately, BTC did get a bearish hourly trigger, daily trigger crossover, fell down towards the weekly trigger. You can see it catch support in this shaded region of the weekly trigger, which indicates bullish velocity and indicates that price will likely catch support in the shaded region. You can see it begins at about 57K in case there's another Bitcoin dip. And you can see the weekly trigger slowly marching higher. You could also see on the bottom the breadth, which shows that all the Bitcoin miners and Bitcoin proxies are currently not exactly in bullish trigger orientation. So most are below their hourly triggers, 2-hour triggers, and 15-minute triggers. Now, over here with Bitcoin, it's going to be range bound between the daily trigger and the weekly trigger until one side breaks. Being that Bitcoin is in a bull market, our assumption is that the weekly trigger will continue to provide support, and eventually Bitcoin will break back above the daily trigger, get a bullish hourly trigger, daily trigger crossover, sort of like we saw here, maybe range bound for a bit, maybe explode right away, but regardless, we are expecting a break to new all-time highs. Now you can see with how strong the monthly and weekly velocity are, it's highly unlikely that Bitcoin is going to crack below 54K, which is where the weekly trigger is, but rather it is a lot more likely that Bitcoin will bounce strongly off the weekly trigger and continue to break to new all-time highs. Now, of course, the weekly trigger is a worst-case scenario. Best case scenario is that Bitcoin is able to get above the daily trigger well before tapping the weekly trigger. Now, just to share a quick example of what that might look like, we'll take a look at QQQ in recent times, which had a very similar bearish hourly trigger, daily trigger crossover, plummeted down to its weekly trigger, and is now back bullish. So let's just wait for this to load. Not sure if it's my internet lagging or trading view, but shouldn't take too long here. Any day now. All right, here we go. So you can see similar story for QQQ. Again, it had a really bullish, strong monthly velocity, strong bullish weekly velocity, as you can see by the shaded region. And this isn't going to load yet, but it doesn't matter because in recent times, what you can see is that bearish hourly trigger, daily trigger crossover. There we go. So QQQ, again, similar rally as Bitcoin. It all started with a break above the monthly trigger and the hourly, daily, and weekly triggers crossing above the monthly trigger, which led to the strong rally. Had a test of the weekly trigger here, was able to bounce, tested the monthly velocity here, bounced strong. And now in recent times, what you'll notice is a bearish hourly trigger, daily trigger crossover led to a trip back down to the weekly trigger before Bitcoin popped back up, rejected its daily trigger again, came back to the weekly trigger, and then finally broke above the daily trigger and got the bullish hourly trigger, daily trigger crossover. And to me, there's no reason to expect anything differently from Bitcoin. I think we're pretty much in the kind of that same area that we just saw with QQQ, where we'd expect either price to break back above the daily trigger and rip to new all-time highs, or we'd expect a final test of the weekly trigger and then bounce up and break above the daily trigger. So what that would look like would be some kind of move down to the weekly trigger, worst case scenario, then bounce and break above the daily trigger, and this breakout should be the one that takes it to new all-time highs. And the best case scenario would be if Bitcoin breaks right above the daily trigger, and then this breakout will lead to new all-time highs. Now, moving on to miner stocks themselves, we'll take a look at Mara first. So, pretty good looking chart here for Mara. A little disappointing that it wasn't able to get follow through on a really bullish looking trigger setup, but apparently the market didn't digest earnings all too great. My bad. So I think all right, there we go. So on this chart for Mara, you can see that the monthly trigger has been a place of accumulation for whales. You can see the dip by here, we can see the dip by here, and no reason to think that the monthly trigger is going to stop being support anytime soon. It's a really strong, powerful level, and although we had a pretty nasty breakdown back below this trigger cluster, it's not hopeless yet. As long as Mara can get back above this trigger cluster, at some point it's going to cause extreme upside acceleration. Now, we had a little bit of a fake out here. We had another fake out here, again, pretty unusual, so I do suspect there might be a little bit of manipulation going on in these miner stocks. Maybe, big funds aren't ready to launch yet, but we do know that there's been massive accumulation in funds in all the miner stocks, especially Mara, CLSK, Wolf, Cypher, Iron. All of these have been getting massive institutional accumulation lately. And so, I think next time Mara can get back above this trigger cluster, it can launch. But another reason why the trigger setups aren't working perfectly is, as we saw with Bitcoin, Bitcoin is still range bound between its daily trigger and its weekly trigger. And until we can get a resolution there, Mara might be just chopping sideways until Bitcoin can start its breakout to new all-time highs. But worst case for Mara, there's a dip down to the monthly trigger. Because the monthly trigger is still shaded, it means there's positive velocity. It is still very likely to get bought here, and I'd be targeting a dip buy in the worst case scenario that it comes down to the high 15s. Otherwise, still a very bullish chart. You can see the monthly is strong bullish, and you can see the weekly is strong bullish. I don't even believe the breakout started yet at all for Mara. You can see in the previous halving cycle, the major explosion higher starts with a breakout of the monthly trigger. In this case, there's been a lot of consolidation since that breakout, but again, I don't believe that the breakout for Mara has nearly begun yet. Here we go. So you'll see here that this breakout started with a break above the monthly trigger right here, and that's what led to the explosion higher right here. There's that monthly trigger breakout. And here we had price break above the monthly trigger, but no real explosion higher yet, which tells me that the move has not even begun yet, and we can expect a similar type move from Mara this cycle. This was, I do believe it was 1,500%. I could be wrong. Oh, I already have it on there. Yeah, 1,590%. So again, I do think it's foolish to think that the move for Mara has already begun. It definitely does not look like it has begun yet, because when a highly shorted stock, especially something as cyclical as Mara, breaks above its monthly trigger, we expect a very strong, ranging, powerful move for at least a year or two before any downside. And since we haven't seen that yet, I don't believe the move has started. Now let's look at some other charts as well. We have CLSK, which is a popular one. And CLSK also extremely bullish chart trigger-wise, as price recently got the breakout above the monthly trigger. Let's go back to the 60-minute time frame. Sorry for the lag. Nothing I can do about it if TradingView is being a little slow. Well, while the rest of the chart loads, you can see that CLSK has had really nice support as price enters into the positive weekly velocity, the shaded area of the weekly trigger. And so once again, I think the worst case scenario for CLSK here is a dip down to the weekly trigger, which will more than likely be bought up. And you can see again, here's the rejection of the monthly trigger and then the breakout of the monthly trigger. Hourly trigger gets above, daily trigger gets above, price back tests the monthly trigger, which held support. The weekly trigger crosses above, and a huge breakout for CLSK. And again, we have no reason to expect at all that the rally is nearly over because with breakouts above the monthly trigger, we expect strong, powerful, bullish price action for really well over a year. And although we did get the breakout in November 2023, it still does not look like this is done whatsoever. If anything, the weekly trigger is just starting to lift off the monthly trigger here. And when the weekly trigger crosses above the monthly trigger, you can expect upside for quite a while. The stock is in a very bullish trigger orientation. And although the hourly trigger is currently below the daily trigger, which means bearish in the short term, as you can see here, hourly strong bearish, daily strong bearish. As long as the monthly is strong bullish and the weekly, even though it's weak bullish, as long as these stay bullish, we expect all dips down to the weekly trigger area, or worst case scenario, to the shaded region of the monthly trigger. These are very, very, very likely to get bought and are high confidence dip buys. So worst case, I'll be looking to dip buy this at 1366. Otherwise, the next time the hourly trigger crosses above the daily trigger, again, this one was cut a little short by Bitcoin's sudden drop. Fake World War III news or whatever that was, that one weekend where everybody thought the world was ending with Israel and Iran. But otherwise, once CLSK gets back above the daily trigger and gets that bullish crossover, we can expect a really powerful, strong upside move for CLSK. Now, my favorite miner personally, Wolf. The reason why it's my favorite is because I think they'll eventually pivot to making money off AI with their low power cost. It's also the highest shorted miner, which I kind of like the underdog story. So Wolf, definitely my favorite at the moment and my largest miner position. I don't expect a major breakout for Wolf until the monthly trigger is broken at 349, but once that does happen, I think we'll see a super powerful move, just like we saw with Mara when it broke its monthly trigger for the first time in the previous halving cycle. Now you can see kind of this bullish pennant setting up. Just move that over. Not sure why I can't adjust the trend line. There we go. So yeah, looks like a very normal bullish pennant, and I think once Wolf is able to break out here, we can easily get that move straight up to the monthly trigger. Now Wolf has definitely respected this trend line on all its dips, and so I'd look to continue accumulating my positions near this trend line. I wouldn't be too worried with a little close below. I'd be more worried if price closes below it in the course of a week. But for now, you got to respect the bulls that are holding on to this trend line support, and I'll keep buying until something breaks. So again, worst case scenario for Wolf, if price does pull back to this trend line, which will line up with the weekly trigger, I'll most definitely be a buyer. And I think with due time, Wolf will make its way up to the monthly trigger. And once price does break above the monthly trigger, I do think that we'll see a really strong short squeeze higher into the double digits range. So overall, I'm bullish on miners because Bitcoin, Mara, CLSK, all the big leaders, Ethereum, Solana are all in their most bullish trigger orientations, which means that the hourly trigger is on top of the daily trigger, on top of the weekly trigger, on top of the monthly trigger. For example, if I show you Ethereum right now, you'll see very easily that with the weekly trigger on top of the monthly trigger, usually we get a lot more upside than what we've seen so far. And so there's no reason to expect at all that the cycle is over. If anything, we might have a pullback to the weekly triggers here in all the major cryptocurrencies, but overall we'd have to expect a bounce off the weekly triggers before continued upside. So maybe at the moment things don't look super bullish, but you can see here for Ethereum, it's holding on to that weekly trigger support. It got its bearish crossover here and has been catching support at the weekly trigger, rejecting the daily trigger. Rejecting the daily trigger, catching support at the weekly trigger, rejecting the daily trigger. And the daily trigger and weekly trigger are getting tighter and tighter here. And due to the fact that there's strong bullish monthly velocity, we'd expect this to resolve bullishly. And once Ethereum can move back above that daily trigger, and we'll look at Solana as well. Probably see a very similar story on Solana, range bound between its weekly, so Solana, again, same thing. bounced off its weekly trigger, I think a couple of times already. Strong bounce here as well. Yeah, into that shaded region, indicating that the weekly trigger area is going to provide support and that it doesn't have to get all the way down to the weekly trigger before a bounce. So we see a nice bounce here, rejecting the daily trigger. Again, same story as Ethereum, coiling as the daily trigger and the weekly trigger get tighter and tighter together. And at some point, there's going to be a resolution, and because the monthly trigger is showing strong bullish monthly velocity, we're going to expect this to resolve to the upside. So again, it could be a little more time as the daily trigger and the weekly trigger, get closer and closer together like we saw with Ethereum before the breakout. But the end result is that we're expecting all major cryptocurrencies to explode higher for another push to new all-time highs, which in turn will take Bitcoin proxies with it, like Mara, CLSK, Cypher, Wolf, Iron. And when they do, I am expecting miners to outperform cryptocurrencies themselves, like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Solana in the final stage of the cycle, as that's what we've seen in previous halving cycles. So I hope you did enjoy this video. If you enjoyed it, would appreciate a like on the video. If you didn't enjoy it, no pressure at all to leave a like. Thank you guys, and I'll see you for the next time.